Gil-galad was an elven king. Of him the harpers sadly sing. The last whose realm was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea. His sword was long, his lance was keen, his shining helm afar was seen. The countless stars of heaven's field were mirrored in his silver shield. But long ago he rode away, and where he dwelleth none can say. For into darkness fell his star, in Mordor where the shadows are. Hello Tolkien geeks! If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing for more Rings of Power analysis and Tolkien and Lord of the Rings lore content. And don't forget to press the like button and even leave a comment below to help this channel reach more new viewers in the future. These videos are made possible by my Patreon community. To check out the benefits of becoming a patron, click the link in the description. As the song goes, Gil-galad was an elven king, the last of the High Kings of the Noldor. The Noldor were the High Elves, sometimes called the Deep Elves, and in Tolkien's early versions of the Legendarium, the Gnomes, or the Noldoli. The Noldor were those who rebelled against the Valar and returned to Middle-earth to wage war against Morgoth, after the first Dark Lord murdered Finwë, the first original king of the Noldor elves, and then stole the famous Silmarils of Fëanor, who was the firstborn son of Finwë. Gil-galad's precise parentage in Tolkien's mythology is a matter of conjecture and interpretation with respect to the source material. The Silmarillion, as it was published in 1977, considers Gil-galad as the son of Fingon, who was High King after the death of his father Fingolfin, the second son of Finwë, and half-brother to Fëanor. Tolkien's later writings, on the other hand, indicate that Gil-galad was the son of Orodreth, which moved him from the royal house of Fingolfin to the house of Fingolfin's younger brother Finarfin, thus making him a closer kinsman of both Galadriel and of her brother Finrod Felagund. Christopher Tolkien admitted in writing at one point that his decision to assign Gil-galad as a child of Fingon in the Silmarillion had been an editorial mistake. In the Rings of Power, Amazon Studios' new Second Age-inspired television series, Benjamin Walker has indicated that his character is the son of Fingon, as depicted in the Silmarillion version. Whatever the case, Gil-galad is first mentioned chronologically in the published works, in the aftermath of the Dagor Bragolach, the great battle of the year 455 of the First Age, in which Morgoth had first broken the siege lines of the Noldor and pushed them back into their own territories. The Dagor Bragolach, in English that's the Battle of Sudden Flame, was the first time that the Dark Lord had deployed his greatest weapon. Glaurung, the father of dragons, came forth, flanked by Balrogs, and belched fire and death on the unprepared elves. Following that bloody massacre, the young Gil-galad was sent, seemingly for his own safety, to the havens of the Falas, the cities of Brythombar and Eglarest, to be fostered by Círdan the Shipwright, the wise and highly respected lord of the Falathrim. After more heavy Noldor losses in the years following the battle, in the year 472, Maedhros, the eldest son of Fëanor, organised a large force to attack, and they marched on Angband to defeat Morgoth himself, finally, and take back the Silmarils. But the battle was lost once again, and became known as the Nirnaeth ar Noediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, one of the greatest tragedies of the First Age. Fingon was killed, and the high kingship passed then to Turgon, his younger brother, who was king in Gondolin. The following year, with the elves now firmly on the back foot, Gil-galad and Círdan were forced to abandon the havens of the Falas and establish a fallback position at the havens of Sirion, a hidden sanctuary close to the great river's estuary, and they also establish an offshore outpost on the Isle of Balar. In the year 510, the city of Gondolin falls to an invasion by the armies of Morgoth. The king of Gondolin, Turgon, is slain, and the title of High King then passes to Gil-galad. Over the course of the next year, refugees who survived the sack of Gondolin flood into the havens, including the mortal Tuor, his wife Idril, daughter of the late king of Gondolin, and their son, the young Eärendil. There they joined the Sindar exiles from the famed forest kingdom of Doriath, which had been overrun by Maedhros and the other sons of Feanor a few years prior, as the Feanorians sought to fulfill their oath to reclaim the Silmarils from any elves who would take them for their own. Among those who escaped was Elwing, the daughter of Dior, king of Doriath, who bore the Silmaril of Beren and Luthien. In 538 of the First Age came the third kinslaying. The surviving sons of Feanor and their forces attacked the last refuge of the Eldar in mainland Beleriand, and it was said that Gil-galad and Círdan hastened from the Isle of Balar to provide aid to Eärendil and Elwing, but arrived too late to defend their allies. Eärendil and Elwing escaped and fled into the west over the sea, and they took the jewel of Feanor with them. Only Maedhros and Maglor of the sons of Feanor survived the assault, and they took the infants Elrond and Elros, the sons of Eärendil, as hostages. After Morgoth was defeated at the end of the First Age, and Thangorodrim was broken in the War of Wrath, with Eärendil returning in the final battle to defeat the dragon Ancalagon the Black, Beleriand was sunk beneath the sea, and many of the Eldar who survived the fight against Morgoth sailed back into the west to live in the peaceful embrace of the Valar once more. Others decided to stay, however, and they were led by the High King Gil-galad. In the Second Age, Gil-galad was the leader of the realm of Lindon. This was effectively the land that was left over after the destruction of Angband and Beleriand, to the west of the Blue Mountains, where the new coastline was formed. Chief amongst his lords were Círdan and Elrond Half-Elven. In the first decades of the Second Age, Círdan's fleet was used by the Edain to transport their people to the newly granted island realm of Númenor. The mighty Númenorians built their great society in the isolation that their island state gave them. And after 6 centuries of the Second Age, the first ships began to arrive off the shores of Lindon, as the men of the west began to sail back to the mainland. Gil-galad, remembering the bravery and sacrifice of their ancestors, received them gladly. It was during the reign of Tar-Meneldur that the friendship between Gil-galad and the men of Númenor first really began to blossom. Meneldur's son Aldarion it was who first founded the Guild of Venturers in the year 750, and he began to attempt to establish a permanent haven on the shores of Middle-earth, just to the southeast along the shoreline, in close proximity to Gil-galad's elves. In addition to his important work in building a beachhead upon the mainland, and building an alliance with the elves, Aldarion also apparently became a close friend to Gil-galad himself. It was said that it was Aldarion who brought a collection of nuts of the Malorn tree as a gift for Gil-galad, though the Melurn weren't able to grow in the rocky terrain in Lindon, and so the High King later gave them to Galadriel, who planted them in Lothlorien. The people of Númenor and the king began to feel that Eldarion had begun to neglect his homeland and his duties as the heir to the throne, and his duties as a husband, when he left the island for long, unexplained voyages abroad to the mainland, where he and his men would perform tasks in the service of High King Gil-galad. Eldarion and Tar Menelder were later reconciled in the year 739, when Eldarion delivered a sealed letter from Gil-galad to the king. In the letter, Gil-galad explained that he had reason to suspect that an evil spirit, a servant of Morgoth, was arising once more in the east. The letter explains Eldarion's long absences to his father, due to Gil-galad's need for a counsellor and an interpreter of the many tongues of men. He had kept the Prince of Númenor in his service for extended periods. Gil-galad begs of the King of Númenor, "If you have any strength of men to spare, lend it to me." Gil-galad was aware of the rise of Sauron before Sauron had openly declared himself, and he was proactively seeking allies and aid, preempting the inevitable invasion of Eriador, which the letter also explicitly states that the High King had actively feared. It would be some centuries later before any invasion from the east would come, however. Eldarion ascended to the throne in the following year, becoming the 6th king of Númenor with his father's abdication, and he began to build on the alliance with Gil-galad and instigate policies which aided in the opposition to the influence of the growing shadow in Middle-earth. When Eldarion's daughter, the first ruling queen of Númenor, took the scepter, many of those policies were undone, however, and the alliance that Gil-galad had attempted to forge became forgotten, at least for a time, by the men of Númenor. Around the year 1200 of the Second Age, Sauron approaches Gil-galad's kingdom of Lindon itself in disguise. The new Dark Lord, at that time, was still able to assume a fair form, and he attempts to appeal to Gil-galad and Lord Elrond, who had become the High King's most trusted advisor. But Gil-galad refuses to treat with him, and Sauron was never allowed to enter Lindon. However, Celebrimbor, a grandson of Feanor, was fooled by Sauron in his guise as Annatar, Lord of Gifts, and he and the Noldor in the realm of Eregion gladly received him there, eager to listen to his counsels. Celebrimbor and the Gwaith y Myrdain were deceived by the Dark Lord, and they started to craft rings, beginning with the lesser rings, before moving on to the other great rings. According to the account given in the Silmarillion, when Annatar appealed to the elves of Eregion, and to others, he used their jealousy of Gil-galad and his realm to shape his rhetoric and manipulate the elves. He spoke of the bliss and beauty of Lindon, and implied that Gil-galad wished to prevent the other Elvish realms from attaining such a level of grandness and majesty. It's remarkable that Sauron was so powerful at this point in his career that he was able to disguise himself effectively from elves as wise and powerful as the likes of Gil-galad and Galadriel. Even if they didn't trust his motives, they were still unable to ascertain his true identity through the illusion of the form he was taking. Over the next several centuries, Sauron, as Annatar, worked with the elves of Eregion to forge rings of power. By the time of the year 1590 of the Second Age, Celebrimbor had, in secret, even from Annatar, forged the three, the elven rings which were to be the mightiest of the rings of power. And, as the three were forged secretly and without Sauron's knowledge, it was said that they did not bear his corruption in the same way as the other great rings. In the year 1600, 10 years later, Sauron forged the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, and his treachery was finally revealed to Celebrimbor. As a result, the Lord of Eregion sent the 3 rings away to secret bearers. High King Gil-galad was given Vilya, the blue ring which bore a sapphire stone set within a golden band. Sauron, desiring to recover the 3 rings for himself, finally launched a full-scale invasion of Eriador, entering the Westerlands through the gap in the Misty Mountains where the land of Calenarthon was located, which later becomes known as the Gap of Rohan, just as Gil-galad's letter to Tar-Menelder had predicted centuries earlier. When the news of the invasion reached Gil-galad, the king was ready to act, having had centuries to prepare for this moment. Gil-galad dispatched a force, led by Lord Elrond, to reinforce Eriador and to aid the elves of Eregion, who would surely be the main targets of Sauron's army. However, Sauron moved more quickly than expected, and with a larger invasion force than the elves could handle, and Eregion was quickly overwhelmed. Celebrimbor himself was captured and tortured, and the Lord of Eregion gave up the 9 and the 7, the rings which would be given by Sauron to men and to the dwarves, respectively. But Celebrimbor managed to conceal the identity of the bearers of the 3, frustrating the Dark Lord. Celebrimbor was executed by a firing squad of orc archers, and his body was mounted as a kind of banner, as the grotesque standard of Sauron's advancing army. These were the dark years of Middle-earth, and Gil-galad was the leader of the opposition to Sauron at this time. However, he never came in person to oppose the armies of Mordor during the War of the Elves and Sauron, as this conflict was known, and sent Elrond in his stead. It was during this time that Rivendell, or Imladris in the Elven tongue, was founded to the north of Eregion. Initially, it was a military base for Elrond's army during the sack and occupation of Eregion, but as we all know, it became Elrond's seat of power after the war, and in the long age to come, up until the War of the Ring. Sauron's armies were about to overrun Elrond's position there, when suddenly the armies of Númenor arrived, sent by Minas Tirith, who was, depending on conflicting accounts in the lore, either Queen Tar-Telperien's heir, or the current king. In Christopher Tolkien's opinion, which I'd agree with, the former makes the most sense. However, there's a conflict with the dates given for the ruling line in the disparate versions. We see here how important Gil-galad was, not just as a commander of armies and as a warrior, but as a statesman. His long-maintained effort to build up alliances with other powers and peoples, most particularly the old alliance with the descendants of the Edain. These alliances saved Eriador and Middle-earth during this first war with Sauron. After the War of the Elves and Sauron, the Elven ring Vilya was bestowed upon Lord Elrond instead. Gil-galad's precise reasons for entrusting his ring to Elrond are not known, but it meant that Elrond was able to preserve and beautify the refuge of Rivendell, which became known colloquially as the Last Homely House. Later in the Second Age, Gil-galad's alliance with the men of Númenor again came into play. After the fall of Númenor and the changing of the world by Eru Ilúvatar, the states of Gondor and Arnor were formed by the exiles of Númenor, who were led by Elendil. Elendil was a descendant of the line of Silmarien. His father had been the last of the lords of Andúnië. He was therefore one of the faithful, the faction of the Númenorian people who had maintained faith to the Valar and friendship with the elves. So Gondor and Arnor were established in the year 3320 of the Second Age, and the realms of men prospered for over a century. Even Gondor, with its proximity to the land of Mordor. Arnor, in the north, was built up in close proximity to the elves of Lindon, and a cordial relationship developed between Gil-galad's High Elves and Elendil. There was a brief spell of relative security in Middle-earth, with the return of the Dunedain. However, all that changed in the year 3429, when Sauron launched an attack on Minas Ithil, the stronghold of Isildur, built in the shadow of the Ephel Duath, which guarded one of the only passes through the mountains of Mordor. This is the same stronghold which would later become the haunted city of Minas Morgul, the home of the Nazgul. Isildur fled the city and eventually came to his father Elendil, whose seat was in Anúminas, on the shores of Lake Evendim in the northern kingdom of Arnor. Isildur brought the news of Sauron's attack and the loss of his city to his father, while his younger brother defended Osgiliath, Gondor's capital city, from the advancing forces of Mordor. The following year, Gil-galad and Elendil formed the last alliance of elves and men, a commitment to march and wage war on Mordor as a combined force. And in fact, though the last alliance was referred to by name as an alliance of elves and men, even the dwarves of Durin's folk joined the effort as well. A passage in Unfinished Tales claims that the last alliance was sealed by a binding oath sworn by both the High King of the Elves, Gil-galad, and the High King of the Dunedain, Elendil, which called the one god Eru himself as a witness. This was an act that was rarely done, either before or after the events of the Dark Years, and it carried with it a weight that could not be easily forsworn. It was told to Frodo and companions, by no less a source than Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings, that Elendil had waited for Gil-galad at the great watchtower of Amon-Sul, better known in later years, after its destruction in the Angmar War in the Third Age, as Weathertop. From there, the two hosts marched to Rivendell, where they camped for 3 years, making plans and forging arms and armour for the invasion of Mordor. In 3434, the armies of Gil-galad and Elendil crossed the Misty Mountains using the passes of Imladris and Caradhras, and joined up with the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the Sylvan elves from Lothlorien and Greenwood, led by Amdir and Oropher respectively. Elrond would later remark, "I remember well the splendour of their banners. It recalled to me the glory of the elder days and the hosts of Beleriand. So many princes and captains were assembled. And yet not so many, nor so fair, as when Thangorodrim was broken, and the elves deemed that evil was ended forever. And it was not so." According to Tolkien's letter number 144 to Mrs. Naomi Mitchison, when Sauron learnt of the advancing hosts of the unified West, he adopted a scorched earth policy, as Tolkien puts it, and burned the gardens of the Entwives south of the Greenwood, in order to slow the progress of the last alliance. And this region became known as the Brown Lands thereafter. Incidentally, Tolkien suggests that this was where many of the Entwives perished, though he seemed reluctant to committing to the idea that all of the Entwives were gone from the world forever. Anyway, eventually the armies of the West reached touching distance of the Black Gate, and they were met there by the army of Sauron between the Dead Marshes and Cirith Gorgor, the Haunted Pass. During the initial fighting, the Orcs of Mordor succeeded in baiting the Sylvan Elves into charging before the High King gave the order. Though the Sylvans were fierce fighters and formidable on their own territory, they lacked the strong arms and armour of their high elven kin, and as they were pulled out of position by the orcs, many of them perished in the dead marshes, including Orather, father of Thranduil. The restless spirits of the slain haunted the marshes for centuries afterward, as told by Gollum in The Lord of the Rings.
Elves and men and orcs, the dead marshes. There was a great battle long ago, yes, so they told him when Smeagol was young, when I was young before the precious came. It was a great battle. Tall men with long swords, and terrible elves, and orcs shrieking. They fought on the plain for days and months at the Black Gate. But the marshes have grown since then, swallowed up the graves, always creeping.
Gil-galad and the Last Alliance defeated the host of Mordor and won the Battle of Dagorlad. The hosts of the West were able to overwhelm and pass through the Morannon, the Black Gates of Mordor, and they besieged the Dark Tower Barad-dûr itself. The siege lasted for 7 long years and claimed the lives of many, including Elendil's son Anarion. Eventually, Sauron himself, wearing the one ring on his finger, left the safety of the tower and broke the siege lines, before pressing on to the slopes of Orodruin, Mount Doom, where he would make his final stand. The two kings, Elendil and Gil-galad, fought there with the Dark Lord in single combat. In the battle, Sauron mortally wounded Elendil, with the sword Narsil breaking beneath him as the King of Men fell. High King Gil-galad, according to the later account of Isildur, was burnt and scorched by the intense heat of Sauron's fiery hand, and was killed as well. And then Isildur, the son of Elendil, took up the broken hilt of his father's sword and cut the ring from Sauron's hand, claiming it for his own. The end of the siege of Barad-dûr and the defeat of Sauron, which also marked the end of the Second Age of Middle-earth, was the last time that elves ever fought alongside men in open warfare against the enemy. Gil-galad's death also meant the end of the line of the High Kings of the Noldor. He was killed without an obvious successor, and neither Elrond nor Galadriel stepped forward to claim the crown. Gil-galad's legacy endured until the time of the War of the Ring, however, when stories were told and songs were sung of his bravery and valour during some of the darkest days in the history of Middle-earth.
And my axe.
Thank you to my Axe Tier Patreon supporters: Erin M., Stephen Stark the Maya, Arvedui of Arnor, Joshua Boniface, Nessie, Sean Edmiston, and V. Hume. Please subscribe to Voice of Geekdom for commentary and analysis on Tolkien's works and Amazon's The Rings of Power. And consider hitting the bell icon to set notifications to all to stay up to date with my future uploads.